All right, welcome to this deep dive. Today, we're unpacking America's colossal World War II effort, but we're doing it through a very specific lens. We're going to look strictly at the monumental, history altering decisions made by its top leaders. It's a fascinating story of pressure and power, so let's jump right in. Picture this: it's December 7th, 1941, the day the United States is violently thrust into a global conflict. Those months right after the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, they were marked by just profound despair and total uncertainty. The global balance of power was literally teetering on the edge of absolute disaster, and democratic nations were at serious risk of collapse. This was the terrifying central conflict that President Franklin D. Roosevelt woke up to, and man, the clock was ticking. So, part one: Roosevelt's strategy right after Pearl Harbor. Now, FDR faced an immediate, staggering crisis right at the start of the war, and it revealed a massive disconnect. You had millions of outraged Americans screaming for a get Japan first approach, right? A war of pure revenge. But Roosevelt makes this highly controversial, yet totally calculated decision to resist that immense public pressure. Instead, he sticks to the pre-war ABC-1 plan. This meant prioritizing the defeat of Germany first to keep Hitler from overwhelming Britain and the Soviet Union. Essentially, he was trading space for time in the Pacific.
And to buy that precious time, FDR had to completely pivot the nation to a total war economy. Just look at these insane numbers directed by the War Production Board. We're talking 40 billion bullets, 300,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks. It's almost hard to wrap your head around. And this unbelievable manufacturing boom didn't just arm the Allied forces, it completely revitalized the American economy. It actually ended the lingering effects of the Great Depression by doubling the gross national product.
And the sheer speed of this industrial boom, completely unprecedented. 14 days. That's it. That is how long it took shipbuilder Henry J. Kaiser, they literally nicknamed him Sir Launch-a-Lot, and his California shipyards to assemble an entire massive cargo Liberty ship completely from scratch. This kind of logistical miracle was basically the backbone keeping the Allies supplied across two massive oceans. All right, part two, let's talk about MacArthur and the Pacific Theater. Shifting our focus across the globe to the Pacific, we meet our next key architect, General Douglas MacArthur. When the Japanese overwhelmed the Philippines in early 1942, FDR actually ordered MacArthur to evacuate to Australia to lead the resistance. It was a brutal situation, leaving his battered troops behind to eventually face the horrific Bataan Death March. But as he left, MacArthur made a personal, iconic vow: I shall return. And that promise, it became the emotional and strategic anchor for the entire American campaign in the Pacific. So, how do you turn that vow into reality? Well, MacArthur, teaming up with Admiral Chester Nimitz, developed this brilliant tactical approach called island hopping. Instead of throwing lives at every single heavily fortified Japanese island, they just bypassed them. They captured the weaker outposts nearby, build airfields, and then use air power to bomb and neutralize those bypassed strongholds. It was a genius strategy that systematically choked off Japanese supply lines while conserving precious American lives. And they executed this devastatingly fast. In May 1942, the Battle of the Coral Sea totally stops the Japanese advance on Australia. Oh, and fun fact, that was the first naval battle in history fought entirely by carrier-based aircraft. The ships never even saw each other. Then, just a month later, the absolute miracle victory at Midway sinks 4 critical Japanese carriers. By August, the U.S. is going on the offensive at Guadalcanal. In the span of just a few months, these rapid victories completely halted Imperial Japan's momentum. The stage was officially set for MacArthur's return. Moving on to part 3, Eisenhower and the opening of the Second Front. Now we jump back over to Europe, where General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the ultimate organizer and diplomat of the Allied forces, faces his first massive test, Operation Torch. Geopolitically, things were boiling over. The Soviet Union was taking catastrophic casualties and fiercely demanding the Western Allies open a second front in Europe to take the pressure off. But the British and Americans, they were super wary of a direct assault on France that early. So as a compromise, Eisenhower pulls off this massive waterborne invasion of 400,000 troops into North Africa in November 1942. They eventually trapped the Axis forces in Tunisia and gained some hugely vital momentum. And that momentum was building toward one specific fateful beachhead. Right before launching the D-Day invasion, arguably the most critical operation of the Western Front, Eisenhower issues an order of the day to his paratroopers. His words? Full victory, nothing else. It perfectly captures his absolute resolve and the sheer do-or-die nature of throwing a massive 4,600-vessel assault at Fortress Europe. Following that order, the push was violent and incredibly rapid. June 1944, the Allies breach Normandy. By August, Allied forces alongside the French resistance are liberating Paris to just absolute widespread joy, and by October, Aachen, the first major German city, falls to U.S. forces. Eisenhower's troops were systematically shattering German defenses, signaling that the collapse of Hitler's totalitarian regime was completely unavoidable. Which brings us to Part 4, President Roosevelt's final days. With victory practically on the horizon, we have to pivot back to our political architect, FDR. He was navigating the insanely complex final phases of both the war and his own life. And here is something truly wild to think about. In 1944, right at the climax of a total global war, America held its presidential election exactly on schedule. Talk about democratic resilience. FDR campaigned through rapidly failing health and managed to secure an unprecedented fourth term. He convinced the public that his seasoned leadership was absolutely essential to finish off the Axis and manage the post-war peace, decisively defeating his youthful Republican challenger, Thomas Dewey. Now, one of the most debated pieces of FDR's leadership was the unconditional surrender policy, which he and Churchill had agreed upon earlier at Casablanca. Roosevelt was walking a total tightrope here. This policy was essential to keep the fragile Allied unity intact, specifically to reassure a deeply suspicious Soviet Union that the West just signed a separate peace treaty with Germany. But it was also highly controversial. Critics argued it actually prolonged the war by forcing the Axis to fight to the bitter end. Plus, it guaranteed massive post-war reconstruction challenges because it demanded the complete destruction of the German government. The endgame in Europe played out with brutal speed. December 1944, the Allies repelled Germany's last desperate surprise offensive at the Battle of the Bulge. Then comes April 1945, a month carrying incredible historical weight. As Soviet forces closed in, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his Berlin bunker. But tragically, just a couple of weeks before that, President Roosevelt died of a cerebral hemorrhage down in Georgia. He spent 12 years engineering this victory, and he missed seeing VE Day by mere weeks. So, Part 5, Truman and the final chapter of the war. This suddenly thrusts our final key figure into the spotlight, Vice President Harry S. Truman. Truman inherits what is arguably the most harrowing dilemma in modern history. The U.S. Navy is suffering severe damage from kamikaze attacks, and Japanese soldiers are fighting to the literal last man on islands like Okinawa. So here's Truman's impossible choice. Does he order a full-scale ground invasion of the Japanese home islands, knowing military planners are predicting catastrophic American casualties? Or does he authorize the use of a terrifying, newly developed secret weapon to force Japan's hand? Before deploying that weapon, Truman, who, remember, is fresh to the world stage, issues a final warning alongside Allied leaders from the Potsdam Conference in July 1945. The ultimatum was crystal clear: surrender unconditionally or face prompt and utter destruction. American bombers dropped tens of thousands of leaflets carrying this exact message over Japan. But Japan, still holding out hope to avoid unconditional surrender, ignored the warning. Behind the scenes, the $2 billion Manhattan Project had yielded a functional atomic weapon, bringing a devastating conclusion to the standoff. On August 6th, the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, causing 70,000 instant deaths. 3 days later, right after the Soviets entered the Pacific War, a second bomb devastated Nagasaki, adding another 80,000 to the death toll. It's a staggering loss of life, but it finally forced Emperor Hirohito to seek peace. On August 14th, Japan accepted defeat, with the Allies making just a single exception to their policy. They allowed Japan to keep their emperor on the throne. When the formal surrender was signed, the total financial cost of the U.S. war effort stood at over $330 billion. To put that in perspective, that is 10 times the cost of World War I and double all federal spending from 1776 combined up to the start of the war. But this unprecedented mobilization didn't just win a war. It permanently transformed the United States from a nation suffering through economic depression into an unrivaled global economic and military superpower, largely untouched by the physical destruction that completely ravaged other nations. Which leaves us with this final thought for today. We've just walked through how the incredibly high-pressure choices of Roosevelt, MacArthur, Eisenhower, and Truman guided the nation to victory. But as you look at the world today, consider this. How did their massive decisions, from trading space for time, to demanding unconditional surrender, to ushering in the atomic age, Not just end World War II, but actively build the complex, tension-filled world we live in today. What parts of their legacy are we literally still navigating right now? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, guys, and I highly encourage you to keep exploring these massive, history-altering decisions.